The planet Kael'thar was burning, not metaphorically. Not in the poetic sense that soldiers use when they describe a hard battle. It was literally burning, its ancient forests reduced to carbon, its silver oceans boiling at the edges where orbital strike weapons had carved craters the size of continents. From space, Kael'thar looked like a dying ember, a world that had once glowed with life now being systematically snuffed out by the cold, calculating hand of conquest. Deep beneath the surface, buried under 300 meters of reinforced stone and emergency-welded Dura steel, the last functioning command center of the Kael'thari Confederation hummed with desperate energy. The emergency lighting cast everything in a deep crimson, the color of blood, the color of warning, the color of endings. Ambassador Vale Sorn stood at the center of it all, his long silver fingers moving across holographic displays that painted an increasingly grim picture. He was tall, even by Kael'thari standards, nearly 2.5 meters, with pale luminescent skin that glowed faintly in darkness, 4 narrow eyes arranged vertically on an elongated face, and a crown of thin, whisker-like sensory filaments that drooped low with grief. Among his people, those filaments were the truest indicator of emotion. Right now, they told everyone in the room exactly what their ambassador felt: despair. Pure, suffocating despair. "Ambassador," said Lieutenant Orvak, a young officer who had aged 20 years in the past week. His voice cracked at the edges like old stone. "We've lost the Eastern Defense Grid. The Sovereignty's drilling machines have broken through to Sublevel 4. They estimate 2 hours before they reach Civilian Shelter Cluster 9. Shelter Cluster 9. Vale Sorn closed his eyes for a moment. 90,000 civilians in that cluster alone. Children. Elderly. The wounded from the first 3 days of bombardment. "What about the western tunnels?" he asked, though he already knew. "Sealed. Sovereignty infantry units are holding every access point. They're not even attacking anymore. They're just waiting. Blocking escape routes. Making sure no one gets out." That was the Sovereignty's methodology. The Galactic Sovereignty, formerly known as the Viranthan Sovereignty, did not conquer through speed or passion. They conquered through patience, systematic, methodical. They would surround a world, destroy its defenses, and then slowly, deliberately tighten their grip until the population had no options left except submission or extinction. They had done it to the Polari, to the Greenwich Collective, to 7 other civilizations in the past 40 years. Now it was Kael'thar's turn. The Sovereignty had arrived 11 days ago with a war fleet of 260 vessels. Kael'thar's entire naval defense force had consisted of 38 ships, proud ships, well-maintained, crewed by brave soldiers, but 38 against 260 was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The Kael'thari fleet had lasted 51 minutes before the last ship was destroyed. Since then, the Sovereignty had been unhurried in its work. Vale Sorn moved to the communication console, a massive curved panel that dominated one wall of the command center. It displayed, in stark white text against black, the list of responses to his aid requests. He had been sending them for 9 days. Celestian Federation, declined, citing non-interference doctrine. Myriad Council, declined, citing treaty obligations with sovereignty. Pelion Remnant, declined, insufficient military resources. Greenwich Collective, no response. Outer Rim Coalition, declined, citing distance and logistical impossibility. Thravian Empire, DEC-lined. Under review by Diplomatic Council, 23 rejections. Each one had arrived with careful diplomatic language, expressions of sympathy, and elaborate explanations for why helping Kael'thar was, regrettably, impossible. Every supposed ally had found a reason. A treaty, a doctrine, a border conflict of their own, political capital they couldn't afford to spend. Vale Sorn had stopped feeling anger about the rejections somewhere around the 15th one. Now he just felt hollow. "There has to be someone," he muttered, almost to himself, scrolling deeper into the database. The Kael'thari Confederation maintained contact records with every known spacefaring civilization within 400 light-years. Most of them had already declined. Others were too small, too distant, or already operating under sovereignty influence. He scrolled past civilizations he recognized, past empires he had personally visited as a younger diplomat, past allies who had once toasted Kael'thar's health at grand galactic summits and now couldn't be bothered to answer a distress call. Then his fourth eye, the smallest, the one Kael'thar used for close reading and fine detail, caught something near the bottom of the list. An entry that had been filed years ago under the category Limited Contact, Behavior Profile, Unpredictable, Humanity. Planet, Earth, Status, isolated by choice. Vale Sorn stared at the entry for a long moment. He knew about humans, in the way most galactic citizens knew about them, through stories that seemed too outlandish to be entirely true. They were a young species, barely 2 centuries into faster-than-light travel, which made them practically infants by galactic standards. They had made no major alliances, signed no significant treaties, and largely kept to themselves in the small cluster of systems they had settled. Most galactic powers considered them a minor curiosity at best, a future problem at worst. But the stories. A Pelian merchant who traded near human space had once told Vale Sorn over strong Kael'thari wine that humans had once repelled an invasion using repurposed agricultural equipment. Another story claimed they had negotiated a hostage situation by making the hostage-takers afraid of them. There was a widely circulated report from the Galactic Intelligence Archive describing how humans had won a naval engagement against superior forces by doing something so tactically unexpected that the enemy fleet's commanding officers had initially refused to believe their own sensor readings. The Galactic Intelligence Archive's official assessment of humanity read, in part, species demonstrates unusual psychological resistance to threat-based deterrence. Recommend caution. Behavior patterns do not conform to standard predictive models, which, in diplomatic language, meant, we don't understand them and that frightens us. Ambassador. It was Orvik again. The drilling sound from Sector 7 has increased. Whatever they're using has broken through another reinforcement layer. The ground trembled slightly, as if to confirm it. Vale Sorn's filaments straightened slightly, not with hope, not yet, but with the particular sharpening of focus that comes when a being has run out of reasonable options and begins considering unreasonable ones. Get me the quantum entanglement channel, he said quietly. And find the Earth frequency. Orvik blinked all 3 of his eyes. Sir? The humans, they have no treaty with us. No obligation. No, I know. Vale Sorn's voice was calm. But they also have no treaty with the sovereignty, no trade agreement to protect, no political relationship to preserve. Every other civilization on this list had something to lose by helping us. The humans have nothing to lose. He paused. And the stories suggest they might be exactly insane enough to try anyway. Orvik opened his mouth, closed it, then turned to his station without another word. The quantum entanglement communicator was the most sophisticated piece of technology in the bunker. It could establish a real-time connection across dozens of light-years by exploiting the instantaneous nature of entangled particle pairs. It took 4 minutes to calibrate the frequency, to lock onto Earth's nearest communication relay. 4 minutes during which Vale Sorn stood completely still, composing himself, deciding what he would say. What do you say to a species you've never spoken to, asking them to fight a war that isn't theirs? The screen flickered. Static. Then an image resolved. A human face. Male by their biological standards. Perhaps 60 years old, with close-cropped silver hair, deep brown skin weathered by years and stress, and eyes that were dark and sharp and immediately, obviously, intelligent. He wore a plain black uniform with a single emblem on the chest, an image of Earth from space, encircled by a thin ring of stars. Behind him, Vale Sorn could see a command center, walls covered in tactical displays, officers moving with controlled urgency, the organized energy of a military installation that was very much operational. This is Fleet Admiral James Okafor, Earth Defense Command, the human said, in accented but clear galactic standard. His voice was measured, not warm, not cold, simply precise. You've reached an unsecured diplomatic frequency. Identify yourself and state your purpose. Vale Sorn straightened to his full height. His sensory filaments rose, a Kael'thari gesture of formal address. Admiral Okafor. I am Ambassador Vale Sorn of the Kael'thari Confederation. Our homeworld is under attack by the Varanthan sovereignty. Our defense forces have been destroyed. Our population, hundreds of millions of civilians, are sheltering underground while sovereignty forces systematically breach our defenses. We have requested aid from 23 separate civilizations. All have declined. He paused, letting that number land. I am contacting Earth because I am out of options, and because I have heard that humanity does not always behave according to conventional expectations. He held the Admiral's gaze through the screen. Admiral, I will not pretend we have anything to offer you. No resources, no strategic value, no treaty that obligates you to act. I am asking you, as one sentient being to another, on behalf of my people who are dying right now, above my head, please help us. Send whatever you can. Send anything. His voice, carefully controlled for most of the speech, cracked very slightly on the last word. Anything. The human admiral was quiet. On his side of the screen, Vale Sorn could see him turn slightly, exchanging a look with someone off camera. There was a brief, muffled conversation, too quiet to make out across the signal. Admiral Okafor held up one finger, a gesture that Vale Sorn had learned meant wait, and pressed something against his ear. 40 seconds of silence. Vale Sorn counted them. Then Admiral Okafor looked back at the screen and something had changed in his expression. The measured neutrality was still there, but underneath it, something else. Something that Vale Sorn, trained in the reading of alien expressions, identified after a moment's consideration as resolve. Ambassador Vale Sorn, the Admiral said, I'm going to tell you something that we don't share publicly. The Varanthan sovereignty has been conducting reconnaissance operations along our border systems for the past 3 years. They've been mapping our defenses, testing response times, learning our patrol patterns. His jaw tightened slightly. We've been watching them do it. We knew they were going to move eventually. We assumed they'd come for us first. Vale Sorn's secondary eyes widened slightly. They came for us instead. They did, which tells us two things. Okafor leaned forward slightly. First, they consider your civilization an easier target, which frankly is going to be a significant miscalculation on their part. Second, their strategy is to build momentum, conquer smaller civilizations, absorb their resources and populations, grow stronger before they come for us. He paused. We've seen this pattern before, in our own history. It doesn't end well for anyone if you let it continue. The ground shook again above Vale Sorn. Somewhere, something structural was giving way. Admiral, he began. We're coming, Okafor said simply. You asked us to send anything. Ambassador, I want to be honest with you. What we're going to send is not anything. It's everything. Earth has been quiet for 2 centuries. Patient, watching, learning. Something that might have been a smile crossed his weathered face, though it didn't reach his eyes. We're done being quiet. He turned away from the screen. Authorize the launch of Carrier Group 7. Full combat complement. Get me Admiral Reva Stormshaw on the line. Tell her Operation Threshold is active, and tell her to take the absolute zero. He looked back at Vale Sorn. We'll be there in 16 hours. 16? Vale Sorn's filaments practically stood on end. The Kael'thar system was 49 light-years from Earth's nearest territory. At maximum conventional FTL, the journey took weeks. Admiral, that's physically. We've been working on our FTL systems, Okafor said with a brevity that suggested significant understatement. Standard physics has always been more of a guideline for us than a rule. Hold your people together, Ambassador. We're on our way. The screen went dark. Vale Sorn stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the blank display. Well, said Orvek quietly from across the room. They're coming. The ambassador's voice held a complicated mixture of emotions that his people's language had 17 different words for, but that roughly translated into the universal concept of, I have no idea if this is going to save us or make things significantly worse, but at least something is happening. How many ships? Orvek asked. He said Carrier Group, and something called the Absolute Zero. Orvek turned back to his station, running quiet calculations. How large is a human carrier group? I don't know, Vale Sorn admitted. Neither of them said anything else. Above them, the drilling continued. 15 hours and 52 minutes later, every sensor array in the Kael'thar system simultaneously shrieked an alarm. The Sovereignty Fleet, arranged in its standard occupation formation around Kael'thar, a precise sphere of 212 remaining vessels, their positions mathematically perfect, their commanders unhurried and completely confident, suddenly detected something large, moving at a velocity that their instruments initially flagged as a calculation error. Supreme Commander Drath Vel stood at the command bridge of the Sovereign's Judgment, his flagship, and stared at the readings with the particular expression of a being who has spent 30 years being the most powerful military force in every room he has ever entered and is encountering, for the first time, a reading that does not make sense. What is that gravitational signature, he said, his voice carrying the flat, controlled tone of someone fighting to remain calm. Unknown, Supreme Commander. His sensor chief, Praetor Naxus, was visibly sweating. The mass reading suggests multiple objects, very large objects. Moving at. She paused, recalculated, paused again. Sir, the velocity reading cannot be correct. Nothing moves that fast within a gravity well. Then your instruments are malfunctioning. Yes, sir, that is the logical explanation. A pause. But they are all malfunctioning simultaneously, all of them. And the gravitational distortion is consistent across every platform. Drathvel turned toward the main viewport, the broad, armored transparency that looked out into the star field surrounding Kael'thar. He saw it before his instruments could confirm it. A tear. A wound in space itself, visible to the naked eye, not as light or explosion, but as a kind of wrongness, a place where the stars behind it seemed to ripple and distort as if reality itself had developed a crack. The tier pulsed with energies that his 3 decades of space warfare had never prepared him for, colors that didn't quite correspond to any wavelength in his species' visual spectrum. And then through that wound came the absolute zero. Later, those sovereignty soldiers who survived would struggle to describe what they saw. Their accounts varied in the particulars, but agreed on the impression it was like watching a mountain decide to move. The absolute zero was 2.7 kilometers long. Its width at the beam was 640 meters. It was not, by any reasonable aesthetic standard, a beautiful ship. Most advanced civilizations had learned over the centuries that efficient starship design tended toward elegant curves, smooth surfaces, and aerodynamic profiles that felt almost organic. The absolute zero was none of these things. It was angles and armor. It was overlapping plates of dark composite material, each one thick enough to shrug off weapons that could crack asteroids. It was bristling with weapon systems the way a sea creature might bristle with defensive spines, not artfully, not decoratively, but with the frank acknowledgement that every weapon mount represented a specific threat that someone had decided needed a specific counter. It was, in the truest sense, not a ship. It was a philosophy made physical. The philosophy being, we have thought very carefully about what it means to fight, and then we built that thought. Directly behind the absolute zero, 5 additional vessels emerged through the same tier. Human carrier ships, each one over a kilometer in length, each one instantly opening its flight deck doors as the tier sealed itself behind the last hull. In the Kael'thari command bunker, Vale Sorn heard his staff react before he could process the tactical display. Orvek made a sound that the ambassador had never heard from the young lieutenant before, something between a gasp and a prayer. By every ancestor who ever lived, someone whispered from the back of the room. Vale Sorn looked at the display. The new contacts were marked in bright green, ally signals broadcasting on the frequency Admiral Okafor had given him. The scale of the contacts relative to the sovereignty fleet was immediately, viscerally clear. The humans had sent 6 ships against 212. And he felt, looking at those 6 green marks, no concern about those odds whatsoever. Which was either an indication of extraordinary faith or evidence that the sight of the absolute zero had temporarily overridden his capacity for rational analysis, perhaps both. Supreme Commander, Preternaxis said, her voice barely controlled, the large vessel is broadcasting on all frequencies. Put it through. The voice that filled the bridge of the Sovereign's judgment was female, calm, and carried the particular quality of absolute certainty. It spoke in galactic standard with a slight human accent, musical in its rhythm, unhurried in its delivery. Viranthan sovereignty vessels. This is Admiral Reva Stormshaw, commanding the United Earthship Absolute Zero, representing the Earth Defense Command and the interests of the planet Earth and all associated human territories. You are currently engaged in the commission of civilizational genocide against the Kael'thari people, a people who have done nothing to provoke this aggression. I am formally requesting that you withdraw your forces from this system immediately, stand down all ground operations, and return all occupied territory to Kael'thari control. You have 3 minutes to respond with compliance confirmation. After that, we will respond in kind to the actions you have been taking against a civilian population. And I promise you, you will not enjoy the comparison. The bridge was silent. Supreme Commander Drath Vel had conquered 11 worlds. He had never, in 30 years of sovereignty military service, been spoken to in that tone, not by anyone. He was, objectively, commanding the most powerful military fleet in the region of space. He was orbiting a planet whose defenses he had systematically destroyed over 11 days. He had 212 warships at his command against what appeared to be 6 human vessels. He was furious. And beneath the fury, somewhere much deeper, a quieter voice that he immediately suppressed was whispering something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Target the human flagship, he said. Everything we have. Show them the cost of this interference. 212 vessels opened fire. The space between the sovereignty fleet and the absolute zero became a storm. Energy beams of a dozen different types, plasma torpedoes, guided kinetic impactors, disruption fields, reality warpers. The combined firepower of the most advanced military fleet in the sector, focused on a single target. The attack took 11 seconds to reach the absolute zero. For a moment, nothing was visible through the sheer density of the weapon's discharge. The entire area around the human ship was hidden behind a curtain of destruction. Then the fire stopped. The absolute zero was there, unchanged. Not unchanged in the way that a ship with powerful shields might weather an attack. Shields flickered, they depleted, they showed the stress of impacts through corona effects and energy dispersion. The absolute zero showed none of that. The weapons had simply stopped. At a certain point, roughly 900 meters from the hull, they had ceased, not deflected, not absorbed in any visible way, simply ceased to exist, as though the space around the human ship operated under slightly different physical rules. Their shields are not registering on any of our sensors, Preternaxis said. Her professional composure had fully collapsed now. She was simply reporting facts in the flat tone of someone who has moved past fear into a kind of stunned mechanical function. I have no reading. No energy signature, no deflection pattern. Thermographic sensors show no heat dispersion, the weapons just— I can see that, Drathvel said. Supreme Commander, the small ships are launching. From the 5 carrier vessels behind the Absolute Zero, they came. First, the automated platforms. Hundreds of them, each one a weapons system without a pilot, guided by computational targeting that operated faster than any organic mind. They spread through the Sovereignty formation like a net, each platform identifying targets with mechanical efficiency, engaging defensive fire while the main assault wave prepared. Then the fighters. Earth called them Harbinger-class interceptors. 340 of them launched in the span of 90 seconds, and even before they reached the Sovereignty formation, they were doing things that made Sovereignty pilots doubt their instruments. A Harbinger would appear at one point in space. Half a second later, it would be 3,000 kilometers away, behind a Sovereignty vessel, already firing. Not because it had moved at impossible speed, but because it had made a microjump, a tiny fold in space so small that the energy cost was negligible if you had the right drive technology, but so precisely targeted that it allowed combat maneuvering that looked, to any observer, like teleportation. They fought like nothing Drathvel had ever seen. Sovereignty doctrine was built on precision, formations, firing solutions, coordinated strikes, calculated risk assessment. Sovereignty pilots were disciplined, trained, professional. They knew where they were supposed to be in every engagement, what they were supposed to be doing, how their actions fit into the larger tactical picture. The human pilots seemed to have decided that tactical pictures were optional. They flew through their own explosions. They used their own ships as decoys, letting Sovereignty targeting systems lock on and then micro-jumping away a millisecond before the weapons arrived, leaving the shots to hit other Sovereignty vessels instead. 2 Harbingers coordinated to fly directly at each other at what appeared to be suicidal closing speed, pulling parallel micro-jumps at the last possible instant that put them both simultaneously behind separate Sovereignty targets. One Harbinger pilot, later reviewed on tactical recordings and confirmed as intentional, had used a Sovereignty heavy cruiser as a physical shield, flying through the cruiser's own hangar bay at full speed while being pursued by 3 Sovereignty fighters, causing all 3 pursuers to abort and scatter to avoid collision. In the Kael'thari command bunker, Vale Soren watched the battle unfold on tactical displays and felt the particular dislocation of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding how war works, suddenly discovering that one party in the conflict is operating from an entirely different understanding. "They're not trying to win," said Orbeck, his voice hushed with something that was definitely awe and possibly also horror. Vale Soren frowned. "They are clearly winning. 47 Sovereignty vessels have been destroyed or disabled in," he checked, 19 minutes. "That's not what I mean." Orbeck pointed to the display. "Look at the targeting patterns. They're not going for the most strategically significant ships first. They're—" He trailed off, studying the pattern. "They're sending a message. They're making sure the Sovereignty fleet has time to understand what's happening to them. They want the survivors to see. They want them to be able to run." Vale Soren looked at the pattern. Orbeck was right. The automated platforms were methodically disabling Sovereignty vessels in a pattern that was leaving escape corridors open. The Harbingers were devastating but targeted. They were not trying to destroy everything simultaneously. They were taking apart the fleet in a way that made the outcome clear while leaving witnesses. This was not just a battle. This was a demonstration. Above, the Absolute Zero had not yet used its primary weapons. On its bridge, Admiral Reva Stormshaw stood at the command position, hands behind her back, watching the tactical display with the expression of someone quietly completing a complex calculation. She was perhaps 50 years old, with sharp features, short dark hair cut practically close, and eyes that her crew had privately noted looked most alive during moments like this. During the particular combination of complexity and chaos that constituted a large-scale naval engagement. "Ma'am," said her weapons chief, Commander Yusuf Adiyemi, "the Sovereignty fleet is beginning to reform for a massed charge. They've pulled 70 remaining vessels into a concentration, and they appear to be preparing a coordinated strike on our position. They're going to try to overwhelm our phase shields with focused fire," Stormshaw said. "Yes, ma'am." "Should we reposition?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Let them commit. When they're fully concentrated, charge the cascade cannon. Ma'am, the Cascade cannon at this range. I know the yield, Commander. A pause. Recall all harbingers from the target zone. Give them 90 seconds. Yes, ma'am. The recall signal went out. The harbingers, all 340 of them, executed coordinated micro-jumps back toward the carrier vessels with a speed and precision that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this order. Within 60 seconds, the battle space in front of the Absolute Zero was cleared of human craft. The 70 Sovereignty vessels finished their formation. Their combined weapon systems spun up. On the Sovereign's judgment, Drathvel watched his tactical display and felt, despite everything, a ghost of his old confidence returning. 70 ships. Combined firepower that had sterilized continents. If they could just breach whatever the humans were using for shields. Fire, he said. 70 ships opened fire simultaneously. The Absolute Zero fired once. The Cascade cannon was mounted in the spine of the ship, a weapon that ran nearly the vessel's entire internal length, requiring the structural mass of a ship that size to even contain it. It did not fire energy exactly. It fired a cascading field effect, a wave of structured quantum collapse that propagated outward from the emission point, causing anything within its effective cone to experience a catastrophic breakdown at the subatomic level. Not an explosion. Not a beam. An ending. The weapon fired for 4 seconds. When it finished, 61 Sovereignty vessels were gone. Not destroyed. Not as the word is commonly understood, with wreckage and expanding gas clouds and residual heat signatures. Gone. The space where they had been contained some dispersed plasma, the faint echo of materials that had ceased to maintain structural coherence. But there were no hulls. No identifiable components, no remains that a recovery team could ever piece into a picture of what had been there. The remaining 9 Sovereignty vessels, those at the edges of the formation who had been partially shielded from the effect by the vessels now no longer in front of them, did not wait to understand what had happened. They ran. Supreme Commander Drathvel was on one of them. As the Sovereign's judgment accelerated toward FTL, its drives charging at a rate that violated standard safety protocols, Drathvel stood on the bridge surrounded by officers who were, all of them, doing what he was doing, trying to find a framework for what they had just witnessed. He had no framework. He had 30 years of warfare. He had conquered 11 worlds. He had faced desperate resistance, innovative tactics, heroic defenses, and the occasional genuinely unpleasant surprise. He had faced all of it from a position of absolute confidence in the fundamental truth that the Varanthan sovereignty was the most powerful military force in this region of space. That truth had just ceased to be true. In approximately 23 minutes. As his ship crossed the FTL threshold, Drathvel transmitted 2 messages. The first was to his high command, a full tactical report, flagged at the highest urgency level, accompanied by the sensor recordings of the engagement. The second was shorter. It went to every sovereignty fleet in operational territory. It had no strategic content, no tactical analysis, no recommendations for countermeasures or revised engagement protocols. It said only, do not go near human space, do not attract their attention. Do not give them a reason. The atmospheric processors that the Sovereignty had deployed across Kael'thar's surface went offline within 40 minutes of the Absolute Zero's arrival. Surgical strikes from Harbinger squadrons, each guided by targeting data that the human AI combat systems had compiled during the opening minutes of the engagement, dismantled every processor with the same methodical efficiency that characterized everything the humans had done. The Kael'thari shelters began receiving atmosphere reports within the hour. Breathable, native composition. Restored. Vale Sorn was still in the command center when the communication came through from the Absolute Zero. The bunker's screens now showed, where 12 hours ago they had displayed the horror of an ongoing occupation, the sight of a planet with no enemy ships in orbit, just human vessels. And one human vessel in particular, hanging in high orbit like an ancient guardian made metal. Admiral Stormshaw's face appeared on his screen. She looked, Vale Sorn thought, exactly the same as she probably looked when reviewing personnel files or eating a meal, completely, unnervingly composed. Ambassador Vale Sorn, she said. The Sovereignty fleet has been neutralized. The atmospheric processors have been destroyed. Our medical units have entered the atmosphere and are coordinating with whatever civil authorities you have available. We estimate shelter breach risk is now 0. The Sovereignty's ground forces surrendered approximately 20 minutes ago. We're currently processing them according to the Galactic Standard Protocols for military detainees. A slight pause. Or as close to those protocols as the Sovereignty themselves have apparently bothered to follow them, which we gather is not particularly close. Vale Sorn's filaments rose to their full height, quivering with an emotion that his people called Vale Thora, roughly translatable as the specific relief of someone who had expected to die and had not. "Admiral Stormshaw," he said, "I find I have very little language for this moment." "You don't need language," she said. "You needed help. You asked for it honestly. That's a rarer thing than it sounds out here." Something shifted in her expression, not quite softening but a slight relaxation of the absolute precision she seemed to maintain as a default. "We've been watching the Sovereignty for a long time, Ambassador. Watching them and the civilizations they've taken apart. Watching the Galactic Accord debate its session after session, watching allies fail allies. Earth chose not to intervene," Veilsorn said quietly. "It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Earth chose not to intervene before we were ready to intervene decisively." She met his eyes through the screen. "There's a difference. When humanity acts, we intend to matter. We spent 150 years getting ready to matter." A pause. "The Sovereignty was eventually going to come for us anyway. They always do. Empires like that always do. Better to stop them while we could also save your people. Better to send a message that was clear enough that we won't need to send it again. The rest of the galaxy will know what happened here within days," Veilsorn said. "The political implications. Good," Stormshaw said simply. "We want them to know. We want every empire that's been using the Galactic Accord as a shield for inaction while civilizations burned to understand that the calculus has changed." She looked at something off-screen briefly. "Your people will need time to recover. We'll leave a small patrol group in your system until you've rebuilt your defenses, not as an occupation force, as a buffer. Nothing comes near Kael'thar without going through us first." Veilsorn was quiet for a moment. "Admiral, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What you said before, about being willing to be. I heard you tell your weapons officer before you fired the large weapon." "I heard you say?" He paused, trying to recall the exact human words. "Let's remind them why they shouldn't have come here." "What did you mean? You don't know us." "Kael'thar is nothing to Earth. Why does this matter to you?" Stormshaw was quiet for 3 seconds. "Because we know what it means to be alone and in danger and asking for help," she finally said. "Humanity remembers what that felt like, Ambassador. Our own history is full of civilizations that were strong asking help from other strong civilizations, while the weak ones, the ones that actually needed help, got left to manage on their own." Her voice was measured, but something underneath it was not. "We decided, when we finally had the power to choose, that we would not be the civilization that looked the other way. Not because it benefits us, not because you have something to offer. Because it's the right thing to do." She met his eyes again. "Your people called out into the dark, Ambassador. We answered. That's all this is." The screen went dark. Veilsorn turned to look at his staff, Orvek. The young officers who had spent 11 days watching everything fall apart and had spent the last hour watching something extraordinary instead. His filaments were still raised, still trembling slightly. He walked to the main display, which now showed the full tactical picture of the Kael'thar system. Clean. Clear. The green markers of human ships in steady orbit. The absence of everything that had been threatening them. "What happens now?" Orvek asked. "We rebuild," Veilsorn said. "We contact our people in the shelters. We assess the damage. We begin." He paused, looking at the shape of the absolute zero on the tactical display. Even in the abstract representation of a strategic map, its scale was obvious, its presence unmistakable. "And we remember." "Remember what?" Veilsorn thought about the Admiral's face, about the calm voice that had offered 3 minutes and then kept its word. About the Cascade cannon that had ended 61 ships, not destroyed them, ended them, with the same measured efficiency that the humans seemed to apply to everything. About the fleet that had crossed 49 light-years in 16 hours. About the message that had gone out tonight to every corner of the galaxy, that there was a species at the edge of known space that had been quiet and patient and watching, and that their patience had now been fully spent. Remember that there exist in this galaxy beings who will cross impossible distances, at great cost and for no personal gain, simply because someone asked, Veilsorn said quietly. And remember that those same beings are absolutely terrifying. He allowed himself, for the first time in 11 days, to sit down. Above Kael'thar, the absolute zero continued its orbit, patient, immovable, and darkly silent. Like a promise kept, like a warning given, like a new force in the galaxy that had finally, decisively, chosen to be present. In the command centers of a dozen empires, the recordings from Kael'thar were already being reviewed. In the chambers of the Galactic Accord, emergency sessions were being called. In the quiet corridors of Sovereignty High Command, officers who had believed themselves invincible were looking at sensor data that proved otherwise. And on Earth, in a command center where Admiral Okafor had watched the entire engagement on a 17-hour delayed feed, the Admiral read Admiral Stormshaw's after-action report, set it down, and said to the empty room, "It begins." Outside the window, the lights of a civilization that had spent 2 centuries preparing for this moment burned steady and bright against the dark. The galaxy had many great powers. Many ancient civilizations with long memories and longer histories. Many empires built on conquest or commerce or carefully maintained peace. It now had something new, not a conqueror. Not an empire, not a peacekeeping force operating under the polite fictions of Galactic Accord doctrine. Something older than all of those things, something that predated civilization's tendency to look away. A neighbor who answered when you called, the kind that monsters were afraid of,